Welcome back for episode 100 of the Hard Truth About B2B e-commerce. Pretty excited about the fact that we actually made it to 100 and didn't give up yet, Tim.
I think it's amazing. Hello, listeners, and thank you for listening. There are folks who have claimed to have listened to every episode. So if you've made it to 100, you gotta message us again and say that you've actually made it through, because we really appreciate that. I do have one statistic about this, Isaiah, I dug up. Fewer than 2% of all podcasts make it past 100 episodes.
I believe it, right? I mean, you make some episodes, you don't get enough listeners, you kind of just give up. And it's kind of not always easy to quantify the value, right? Like not everyone's going to get a ton of sponsorship money and whatnot. So
no, that's true. So, I wanted to, we had, done a couple different things, taken some breaks, taken some pauses in here, had a few other episodes. I want to mention a few folks to shout out to, folks who've reached out. And then I'm going to throw it back to you, Isaiah, to introduce our eminent guest who has been on our podcast before and is perfectly appropriate to our 100th episode. So let me do a couple things here. First, I want to mention, I'm going to have to look at my phone because I got a lot of folks. Robert West, he works in financial services. He listens to us. I have Sherry Henderson. I have Liz Vondahar, Lisa Asbury, and Joe Lewandowski and Joel Rodruck. These are among the many listeners. I always ask people to reach out and say hi, tell us what you like, tell us what you think. And there are always folks who do. So thank you to all of you and continue to reach out. Now I'm just going to pause for a second so we can insert our sponsor mentions, and I'll throw it back to Isaiah. Balance is a B2B e-commerce payment solution that works well for you and for your buyers. It offers a seamless one-click checkout for almost any payment method, including ACH, wire, checks, cards, even terms. It's used by leaders in B2B e-commerce, and it's as easy as buying a shirt from Amazon. Check them out at getbalance.com. Book a session and tell them what your needs are. They are the first dedicated payment platform for B2B e-commerce, 100% tailored to your needs. Thanks again to our sponsor, Balance. Isaiah, who do we have today?
yeah, I'm excited to introduce Paul Do Forno, practice lead of B2B commerce at Deloitte Digital. I believe you guys are, at this point, the largest commerce practice of all agencies. So people that aren't as familiar in the agency world, there's various levels, right? And you have like the little baby ones. Trellis were kind of the smaller mid-size, and Deloitte Digital is all the way at the top. So Paul, super excited to have you. And also, this is our first time post in person, so I get to actually meet you.
Yeah. So thanks for having me, especially on number 100. I feel very privileged.
Well, thank you.
So yeah, and it's great to find people who are super passionate about B2B and B2B commerce, because it is definitely different than B2C. And anybody that tells you that B2B is just like all you need to do is be more B2C-ish doesn't really understand what B2B commerce is all about. And that's one of my passions, is really to educate and help people understand the opportunity, because the opportunity in front of everybody, it's a massive TAM out there to help companies really change and grow, and excited to talk about it today.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the reasons we called it the hard truth about B2B e-commerce, because I think people assume like, oh, we're just going to like build this, e-com site and throw my products up and it's going to work. And it's a lot harder than that. I mean, that's been at Trellis, we do B2B and B2C, and the B2B projects are generally a lot harder.
Yeah, and it's just different. And just a little bit about myself. So I'm a partner at Deloitte. I lead up the B2B commerce practice. I've been doing commerce, both B2C and B2B, for over 20 years. And so I've been involved in this through a long time. I've actually sat on the advisory board of every major e-commerce vendor out there, enterprise player, and Deloitte itself is, we do everything from, we have digital studios, design, industry experts, to large offshore development center that build all of the major e-com players, and then we operate them. So we're working with some of the largest, and thanks for pointing that out. We are the largest, globally, been recognized by Forrester, Gartner, etc. But love to jump into this and talk all things B2B commerce.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to. Let's kind of go right into. You did a talk at B2B Envision, and I think that was, I think what people are missing in terms of the value of this TAM, right? It's not just the direct sales, it's the influence across the whole ecosystem of channels, right? And so that's what I think is kind of missing from the conversation, because people just look at it as like, oh, it's just how much did I make on the site,
Yeah, and maybe I could step back and kind of paint the picture of what the opportunity is, and then we can kind of get into where B2B commerce can help. So if you look at the US B2B economy, there's probably, and these are stats that Digital Commerce 360 is probably the best consolidation of data in this space. They estimated last year that there were $17 trillion of B2B payments done. So in essence, transactions between two companies. And so,
is that worldwide or the US? Or
no, you just US.
Just US. Wow.
Yeah, just so that's pretty massive, right?
Yeah.
Like just between businesses. And so if you think the latest stat, and it's, again, these are estimates, anywhere from the high 40s to the low 50% are done digitally.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so half of those are done manually. Right. And when we say manual, it may be a check, a physical check, cash, a wire. And when you send a wire, that means that somebody's got to go in, find the wire, do the accounting, put it into the system. So it's not, there's manual transactions that have to go through that. So
yeah,
that's a massive opportunity. So not only that 50% of all of those manual tasks will be, I think, go into some bucket of electronic. And also the other TAM of, one of the biggest areas is, leveraging EDI, which now has become almost legacy, right? It's over 40 years old, and some of the largest vendors are still using it, but it's not as flexible, etc. So the opportunity for B2B commerce to help digitize all of those manual and non-prime ways of transacting is massive.
Yeah, it's bigger than B2C basically, right? And I think that's what people don't realize. Yeah,
absolutely.
But complicated, right? So let's get I'm curious to hear your perspective on EDI. I mean, it's still such a big part of B2B transacting. Do you think that will evolve into a more like modern API B2B commerce kind of thing, or it's just going to stay don't break it, don't fix it because it works kind of thing? What's the
I don't think EDI is not going to change at this point. And I think it'll be around for a long time, because it's so entwined on some of the major players. I think what you'll see around the edges, it'll go down over time, and might go over into procurement punch outs, right? That those are an opportunity, and or direct B2B commerce. And that kind of leads me to kind of you need to think about all of this B2B commerce, and as you alluded to, I like to talk about it as OmniChannel B2B commerce, because it forces people to think about all the things digital that could you could interact with that could then translate into a business transaction?
Where would you start? Like if I'm a business, I don't know, mid-market, B2B company, how do I even think about this? Like I don't.
Yeah. So this is where I have the pleasure of working with a lot of really smart industry people. So within Deloitte, we have, like, you pick the industry, chemicals, oils, gas. They've come from those businesses and really understand those businesses. And so each industry will be slightly different, right? But like a big chunk of these B2B businesses have what you would call kind of a commercialization strategy, meaning what's my segmentation strategy to reach their clients. So, you might start off and say, hey, my client, if your major client is, you have like one client that you're trying to always sell to, you have a very different strategy than if you have 1,000 clients. Sure. And then how to transact. So it's really first start with your segmentation strategy, and every industry has their own commercialization overarching strategy, which means what kind of salespeople do I have? What kind of incentives for them? How do I fit in how I'm going to reach those segments, right? And so I've now partnered with my commercialization strategy guys on, okay, my goal is to help you make all things digital. What are all the ways that I make life easier for you to do business with your customers? And that's really the focus of what we've done from a B2B perspective.
And, related to that, what I've just seen, and I wonder if you see the same thing, is that, clients are driving a lot of the change, right? It's so, a client will get attached to a company and say, well, why don't you do it this way? Or this is how we do it. And, we're 100% digitized, or whatever word you want to use, in all of our processes. So how are you going to accommodate us? And I really, really like that we've gotten to that point, because it really took quite a while, but now I feel like that's the majority of clients who are coming into contact with any of these major companies. They're really driving so much of this. So it's a nice partnership. You say, here's what I want and here's what I need.
Yeah,
here's what I want and what I need.
We have a request for an estimate on a project, and it's driven because that kind of value-added reseller, I guess you could call them distributor, one of their large customers is basically forcing them to deliver an API and like a digital kind of infrastructure for them. Sure. So like they're now having to go out and look at e-com kind of type solutions because their own customer is kind of like forcing them to do that. So it wasn't their idea, it was their customer,
Yeah, you're seeing a lot of that in a lot of your agreements. Like if I sign up to be a supplier, they're like, okay, well, great. You now have to leverage our procurement system, or, hey, you need to provide a B2B commerce way or an automated way, right? And, when I talk about this OmniChannel and talk about these segments, a lot of time your largest customers are using EDI. Your next segment is probably they're using some form of procurement system, be it Coupa, Ariba, and there's a ton of other ones that then they're saying, hey, if you want to leverage us, you're going to have to like plug into that. And that's where the opportunity to do, the term's called punch out, which is basically a way to connect your B2B commerce platform into these procurement systems.
Do you find that typically works best with a B2B commerce platform, right? Like is it better to do it versus the ERP going straight that way, or?
It's a similar form. I think what, quote unquote, the punch out is kind of the best of both worlds. It's an automation, but then it also goes into, you get to take advantage of your commerce system so that experience is more aligned to what people would expect. So instead of just being a SKU and a line item in Coupa or Ariba, it would actually go into your B2B. They would see their experience in their store, but then when they go to checkout, it goes back into the procurement and follows the and it follows their track along that. So
but they get the commerce, they get the Amazon, like,
exactly. They get your personalized experience while staying the fulfillment and the rules around purchasing and all those payments stick to the procurement side.
I think this is just a perfect example of how much more complicated B2B is. When you're like, B2B is just like B2C. It's like punch out, procurement, EDI.
Yeah.
Like, we're just like scratching the surface of all this, like a lot. I definitely would say from our experience with B2B, it's heavily more integration focused, right? A lot more integration type projects. Whereas a lot of B2C companies can kind of get away with maybe a simpler, Shopify kind of setup that doesn't have.
Well, also what I would say too, one of the biggest differences I've seen is really just about, I think you used the word legacy earlier. It's that B2B in general has been around longer. I know that's kind of a weird way to put it, but all of these, the businesses that I've worked with are sometimes 125 years old, right? And they have all of these different things going on. Whereas somehow in the B2C world, even the older companies still figured out a way to shift, maybe because it was simpler, as Isaiah is saying, to move into, B2C e-commerce, 20 years ago or whatever, right? So now when you have all of these different things that have been happening for 125 years, in your, business, or you're trying to deal with your clients, it's a lot harder to move, that kind of a mountain, right? It just takes a little bit longer, takes a lot more to clear out, as you're moving through it all,
Yeah, I think the biggest delta that people forget, right? If you're doing B2C, you have one person you're targeting.
Yeah.
They'll make that purchase then and there.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas a B2B system might be supporting 10 different personas, the sales manager, the field sales staff, support people, right? Like there's a lot of different personas that you have to like bring along and get them to understand. So it's not just you're convincing one person, you have to convince a committee and you have to support all these different types of roles and interactions. So it just makes it a lot more complicated, as opposed to, if I'm going to buy those $150 shoes or not, it's up to me. And I can get excited, hit a button, I'm done. Where, you can imagine getting on a new customer at a chemicals company and all the things that you have to go through to get that to happen, right? So that's the thing, to step back and really understand the mega difference between B2B and B2C.
It's also their job, right? I think I forget who brought it up. It was maybe on our podcast, or is like, these people are buying for their job. They want it to be efficient, fast, convenient. Like, they're not having fun buying shoes. Yeah. For the most part, like, it's not their their pleasure. Whereas like my wife loves, browsing on, fashion sites. It's not, it's not the same,
and that's a great point. And we've done lots of voice of the customer research. So as part of when we, roll out these big digital transformations, we'll like interview tons of people in and around the business, and we'll get them coming back with, some of the feedback. They say too many handoff, unable to track orders, I can't print my invoice. And the number one thing that people say that, from a voice of the customer troubles is you're hard to do business with.
Yep.
Right. And so the number one thing you're actually trying to do with B2B commerce is not just about buying, it's how do you make it easy to do business with? To Isaiah's point, is this is a job. I just want to like get this done and get on to my next thing, right? It's
the voice of the customer stuff that I see, from a variety of perspectives, because some of the client projects I've worked on, we've paid for that to happen. Like, we're getting all of this data in, and it's saying exactly the same things you are. And one of the things I brought up in this podcast over and over again is a lot of the customers will just hold up their phone or say, I want to do, like I want to transact here, because this is what I have in my hand when I'm out on the floor or I'm out visiting a distributor or whatever. And that is a driver too. It's just like, come on, we've got to get from here over to here and then get beyond, because this is the way people live now while they're doing their jobs. They're doing their job with their phone in their hand, wanting to transact in a certain way.
Absolutely.
Do you think that B2B companies, or just, a lot of companies, I think B2B especially now, is going to become more ubiquitous in the D2C world, because these D2C companies are realizing it's not that profitable to like just do D2C, and they need retail and they need multi-channel. Do you think that B2B companies are underestimating how hard it is to do business with them? Like, they think they're easy to do business and they think people want to like call them up on the phone and they think it's fine, but then when you actually talk to their customers, you're getting like a different story. Is there like a gap there that's happening in the market?
So B2B is so big, right? You're talking about 17 trillion, so many different industries,
yeah,
right?
I know I'm generalizing quite a bit. I'm trying to give some perspectives.
Yeah, if you look at the different bucket, big, our biggest growth over the past year and a half, 2 years has actually been in, industries that have been the slowest to go digital, right? And that's companies like chemicals, oil and gas, because for many reasons, like you can imagine the traditional sales job that normally drove all of those things. And plus the perception of, oh, this is too complicated and there's a lot of regulatory. And so we can't do that. I don't want to do this all online. And there's sensitivity. And so what we're seeing there, which is a very sales driven organizations, that in those you're starting with just the basics, right? People just learning to get kind of the basics going. And so a lot of that is being driven, interestingly, by catching up. Like they've delayed. And the number one forcing thing that's happening is many of them, one of the most used ERPs is SAP, and they have to be, right now, the whole SAP world is moving to S4, and they have to get to the latest upgrade. And so it's kind of pulling in, they're like, well, if we're going to upgrade our back office, we might as well upgrade our front office. And
I'm working with a mining company. It's the same sort of thing. I mean, having these conversations is really eye-opening in a way with them. It's like, they're saying, well, we never had to get here. Now we have to get here, right? It's a very different conversation.
So we find that ERP is one of the limiting, kind of biggest challenging factors of e-commerce, B2B e-commerce, right? It's where a lot of the core information is. Do you think that that's what's holding a lot of the industry back, is that, they're not upgraded, they don't have the latest APIs, they weren't built to, like, a lot of the ERPs also weren't really well built for like getting data out in real time. Like they weren't really built for e-commerce. Do you think that's a big part of what is holding the industry back? Because it doesn't seem to affect B2C as much from what I've seen.
No, it's more of it's kind of a different problem altogether, and it's different by industry. It's more of just the sales strategies, right? Like the commercialization strategies has been more via sales channels, right? And so you're doing a massive transformation from people sales to digital sales, supported sales. And so many times there's a lot of fear in these sales organizations, like, I don't want to lose my job into a digital channel. And really, that's a lot of what's holding people back. And the old guard used to doing it the same old way, right?
So you think that's the bigger factor versus the technology. So you don't think technology is the main issue then?
No, it's in my experience, it's always been more perception, growth, like is there incremental value, where on the B2C side, it's the consumers are driving that. They are driving the demand, because they're, if you're not online, they're buying somewhere else.
Yeah.
Where in businesses, the competition and the segment, their commercialization strategy may not be tied to making it, in some ways, they've trained their customers to be spoiled. Like, hey, I'm just going to call this guy and give it to me,
Yeah.
what you want. So it's much more of a softer reasons and more, business strategy reasons than really any technical.
So how are you driving past that? Like, is there the CEOs like, we just got to do this, and they're kind of steamrolling those people, or like I mean, Tim, we've talked a little bit of this, like the organizations are starting top down to like kind of, seems like they're forcing some of the change a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just dive into that and then let Paul provide his perspective. But we have talked about this on the podcast from a number of angles, because it's like direct experience that we're just having in our lives, and it is a difference that I've seen where there is more top down, saying, okay, it's time, we're just going to do it. I'm done with the resistance. We're tired of like hearing all of these roadblocks that are being put up. And, it used to be some time ago that sales would be resistant because they were worried about, exactly how, dollars are going to be flowing. But that's not really an issue anymore. Sales is not the issue. I've heard more recently issues from some distributor and reseller and other type of networks, but even that's falling away because they're realizing that they're not going to be shut out. They're being given opportunities to do things quicker and better to more people. I think it's more that conversation, but it's been fascinating that the whole C-suite board, level people really are changing. And I think that they're seeing the value and they're able to talk about the value. Like if a board meeting comes up, and you could talk about this directly, but if a board meeting comes up, in my experience, there's usually somebody in that room who can say, well, here's how it works and here's how we're going to benefit. And that didn't happen 5 years ago or 10 years ago. What do you think?
And I can add a few interesting things. So one, the money drives it always, right? So first thing, you're starting to hear people on Wall Street ask, how digitized are you? What's your penetration? Like how much revenue is going through? So for the first time, we've heard on some calls on quarterly, results, like they're actually asking that.
Yep.
I think Watsco or Watco is a good example of that they report that in their earnings. Watco distributor, and I think they've done pretty well with that.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah. And so that shows that gives the premium, because it comes across, you're being more efficient, better use of dollars, like those are, they're translating. And I'll give another real world example. We worked with a chemical company and we worked with their distribution arm, and we implemented their commerce capability. And again, they had been reticent in starting, and we started with, just some of the core capabilities of not even ordering, just being able to see their order and some customer support work. And we got them into ordering. And then after 2 years or 2.5 years, they got carved out and they were being shopped by a PE firm. And because of and the transaction ended up being somewhere in like $1 billion range.
Wow.
And they attributed between 150 and $200 million of that value came from them having their B2B commerce capability in there.
Wow.
Imagine that. And that was a significant payback, right? And just to see,
they didn't pay you 200 million, or
no, I wish I had multiple.
Are you sure
he's actually on his yacht right now?
Is that why you're going on vacation soon?
Yeah, there you go.
He's on his yacht.
You probably feel like you get underpaid when that stuff happens, right? You're like, oh, maybe.
No, but I think it's an important story to share. Like the value of B2B is that more and more it's going to translate into your corporate worth, right? And we're seeing it more and more.
Yeah, because you're buying an infrastructure, right? This repeatable, it's not really very compelling to say, oh, I'm going to go buy a manual Salesforce, right? Like I'm buying this company. What is the company? It's a bunch of people that talk on the phone. Like it's that value in today's world is going down, right? I mean, it's not what people want to buy from a Wall Street.
Well, they're the concern, like, right? If you think of who's going to survive, if you're more digitally savvy and be able to react to markets and, you know, sell better, you're going to be able to compete much more than the other competition. And that's really what the why they're getting the bump up of values on.
So you see this at some of the highest levels, right? Do you see this trickling down? What's a little, I mean, scary to me is that some of these mid-market smaller guys, their heads in the sand, they're not taking it seriously enough. They're going with the cheap options, which doesn't really get it done. And when I see cheap, you're going to laugh because like cheap is all relative. There's like, you know, we're in some ways we're cheap, but they think we're expensive. And so do you see that trickling down to them? Like, because if their bigger competitors are starting to take this more seriously, it's got to affect them, right? They must have to catch up, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it's the overall marketplace. In some ways, I would spin it the other way. Like the reason that the small guys survive is that they can be more nimble.
Yes.
And
yeah.
If the big guys are now starting to do it en masse, you're behind the curve, right?
Well, I think that's a really important point because I think that was definitely true in B2C, and the small guys spin up a quick Shopify site. They could be like super nimble and have this like beautiful, you know, Gymshark is I think you guys familiar with Gymshark?
Sure.
Yep.
Sure.
Like you know, kind of this like fast growing D2C, like super nimble. I'm not seeing that in B2B because a lot of these, first of all, and I don't want to be ageist here, like a lot of these companies are run by people that are not digitally native people. You know, it's people kind of on the way out of their careers, and they just don't seem that eager to be the fast moving, the early mover. So I'm not seeing that. Is what
no. I mean, I think you're bringing up a really good point. I don't think you're really being ageist. I think it's more of it is a generational thing, right? So, you know, I'm in my 50s, and I always bring this up in the podcast. You know, I like telling cute old-timey stories about early in my career, but also I'm a guy in my 50s who's been doing e-commerce for 24 years now, right? I mean, so all of those 24 years worth of experience are now moving into the C-suite if they haven't already, right? So people who have been doing e-commerce and digital marketing and all this sort of stuff in one way or another are at C-level, right? And the folks who didn't have the opportunity to do all that stuff are probably retiring and moving on and whatever. So a lot of what you're bringing up, I think, is just, it's the generational shift, right? There's a shift going on. The same is going to be true for, you know, how social media savvy companies are. This is something I was on in another interview where I was talking with people about this, and it's all related, right? Because, you know, people became mobile aware and social media aware, you know, when, like a decade ago for social, right? It's not like 25 years ago for social. So it's a very, very different movement into the B2B. You know,
I find a lot of what's enacting the change is either the next generation has taken over, right? And they're like, oh, let's do something different. Let's change things. Let's, you know, we got to innovate, or the private equity has bought them.
Yeah.
And the private equity is like, we got to do something because we bought this company and we can't just not do anything. So I don't know, I just find it interesting that they're not, to your point, being small, your advantage being smaller is being able to move nimble and move faster, but I'm not seeing that unless they're bought by private equity, which is a little scary to me.
And I think you're seeing a lot of that. I mean, just to build on that point, like it's primarily, I forget the exact number, but they talked about the amount of boomers retiring, the boomer generation, of the amount of businesses that they control that they're trying to sell and move off of is probably the cohort that you're talking about. And that's probably the massive opportunity. Like, if you were a role, like back in the days where they're looking at, the height of COVID and these roll-up firms that buy B2C, I would be looking at B2B firms to roll up and buy, because I think because those are actually,
they're profitable.
Automation could be an opportunity.
Yeah, I agree. And they're actually profitable.
Yeah.
Some of these Amazon roll-ups, I don't think they've gone very well.
No.
No, I mean, and this is something that, I mean, again, I love touching on this topic specifically, Paul, because there are so many companies actually that are doing well that could be, acquisition targets, invested targets, whatever. For some reason, it hasn't happened quite yet. And B2B, I really do see a lot of success, and maybe some of it's hidden, maybe some of it is people aren't ready yet, to move it along. But there is a lot of success out there.
So are we starting our B2B roll-up company after this?
I think we should. That's coming up next, everyone. Listeners,
it's not even theoretical. Like, I had a conversation with a guy who was thinking about joining a PE to literally do this, that there's so many mom and pop, we were talking to $3 to $5 million businesses that they're going to retire. They haven't, should we sell? Should we automate and all that? They're kind of stuck in that.
My friend just sold his dad built the company, and he could have, I guess, taken it over, but they decided to sell. And classic $12 million corrugated box distributor, no digital commerce, super old ERP system, like all manual, all phone calls, email, sales. And then they just rolled up into now a more sophisticated box.
Maybe Greif bought them. Greif is one of the largest based here in Columbus.
It might be. I don't remember the name. I can ask him, but yeah, it's exactly what you're saying though. It's like literally, and he's been super happy. He's like, it was great. Like, now we're more sophisticated. I don't have to deal with he knew he wasn't gonna modernize everything himself, and so. So what advice would you have for those businesses that are 20, 30, 50 million, 100 million? They're not Caterpillar, they're not 3M at B2B Envision, who are already 10 years into this journey and have the mobile app. What should they be doing?
Again, I would go back to what we do. I would go back to what we do for all the big guys, right? Start from your commercialization strategy. Mm-hmm. What are the ways? And you don't have to reinvent the wheel and do everything, right? How do you reduce friction points all along your selling process? And that's how that's what I try and start with, so that there's no silver bullet.
Yeah.
And every industry is slightly different. And so we kind of talk about that. So, look at the segments. Where do you want to grow? Is there a new segment that you haven't gotten into, you want to get into? Then there's a play, right? Or your current area, you haven't expanded more because you only have one sales guy. Is there an extension of selling online that will help you? So it really starts with understanding your segments and what tools can help you in each of those segments.
So would you say that let's break that down in
sure.
A lot of it sounds to me has to do with the fact that hey, if you have this one mega customer like Walmart or something, mm-hmm. then that strategy is going to be we're going to just integrate into them with EDI or Punch Out and go super deep into that, versus all right, I have 1,000 $10,000 a year customers. That seems to me more the traditional B2B commerce play, because they're going to self-serve, and I want to go in and buy, some extra supplies in my own time. I don't want to have to call someone every time. How do you?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, in the example you had, if you have, 500 customers, then, you're not gonna, you may not, and you're much smaller, you may not have enough salespeople to drive all that. So how can you like drive all these automations? And a lot of what, and again, thinking about our strategy, we talk about front office.
Yeah.
And so when I'm selling anymore, even with our largest, we're not just talking about commerce, we just say front office, because, you know, and we have this whole, what we call lead to loyalty, right? From awareness of the product to search, like how do you support all of that from learning about the product to post-purchase and support, you know, through it all. And so really looking to how do you figure out the best bang for the buck? And you can do this at all levels. So, you know, starting off, like if it's a new segmentation, the best application of the general direct, what I call direct B2B commerce, is for when you have tons of smaller vendors and trying to, you know, provide that, you know, provide those services online.
Yeah. So the direct B2B commerce makes a lot of sense for larger volume of customers.
Yep.
If they have less customers, it's more of like almost like an integration play, or do you guys pitch more of like an iPaaS kind of approach?
And so again, then looking at that, you might also, the other thing not to forget about when we talk about this omni-channel commerce is that you might have use marketplaces, and the marketplaces either to sell on the marketplaces or for you to have a marketplace. So for example, let's say I sell a product and the customer always needs to buy 2 other things associated with that product, but I don't sell it. Potentially you have an opportunity either to source that product and be part of those kits and sell them together, or you could have a marketplace that facilitates your partners to sell together, right? And that's what we always go back to, like, what is the pain points of your customer? Talk to your customers, talk to the potential customer. What are their pain points? If you can make it, if you go back to what are the ways that I'm making their life easier, it's your job. That's how you're going to sell.
Yeah. What size do you typically see that the marketplace play for themselves make sense versus like, hey, look, you're not going to be able to build it yourself. It's too much. Go on Amazon. Is there some sort of math there that you guys see?
No, because we've seen it all over the place. Like even the smallest guys having their own marketplace and building that out, and that's a whole strategy onto itself. And whether you want to avoid using Amazon Business or not, like that could be another channel. In fact, you know, there's probably I think the last number that I saw, there's between 100 to 200 vertical specialty marketplaces that are out there primarily in North America. Like it's not just Amazon. Amazon, of course, is the largest, doing, you know, I think last year they did in the neighborhood of 35 billion. But, you know, there's big players that have been out there already doing tons and tons of business, that figuring out how do you, and the thing that I've talking to them is that you need this core commerce engine one way or another, right? Whether you're selling direct, you're going to marketplaces, you're going to punch out, you're doing whatever, you need a core capability to communicate out and sell. And so that's kind of like, no matter what, you're going to need that core capability.
I mean, I think part of what you just said is very interesting, and a lot of folks may not be aware of this, is that, you know, the proliferation of marketplaces that are highly specialized and very, you know, specific. You know, I've worked with a lot of people in apparel and fashion accessories and whatever, and there are marketplaces like for, you know, just like leather, and then recycled leather, and then non-animal product leather, and then all of these things. But they're marketplaces that are so specific and populated by everybody who needs to be in there. So if one of those doesn't exist for the world that you're in, or that your customers are in, then you can also justify creating one. If one exists, you certainly can, you know, justify participating in one. But there are many. I keep bumping into them, and it's amazing to me how many there are, because a regular consumer, how would you know that, and why would you know that, right? It just, you have to be in that world, and all of a sudden there it is. It's like, oh, I have 10,000 options to get leather for my belt. It's just really incredible.
Like Brizos, the steel marketplace.
Yeah,
they were there at B2B Envision. Let's talk, because what you said I think is really important. I think a lot of these smaller B2B companies or even larger ones don't get that concept, and they're so used to the ERP being their central core technology. Because some of them think that that's fine. Like, why can't they do that? Why can't they use the ERP as the commerce engine? Or why is it different? Why is it its own thing?
Yeah, well, predominantly most of the ERPs are not set up to really deal with all the different external channels, be it web, mobile, all of those things. They're not set up to really support that. And because people want, like, again, from different industries, like, you need to go through the details of a product. You need to present the product. You need to maybe look at the specs of all that. And that gets into, okay, well, I need a web page. I need to be presented well. And ERPs really aren't set up to do that. And so this whole engagement of externally, really, the commerce is like, and this is why it gets, and even you're breaking down, even in these big companies, they're learning, like, they've traditionally have had very, this is this side and that's this, and ERP in the back office in the back. Commerce is like in the middle of it all.
Yeah.
Right. So we're literally right in the middle of the back office and the front office to support it, to hit all the things. And people don't understand how complicated it is, because you're dealing from the beginning until the end and supporting all this stuff. Right. And so this is where the opportunity and then the challenge that sometimes people don't understand is that, like, if you're trying to engage and sell and make it easier to do business with, the commerce enables that in all of these new channels where ERP was meant to be a back office task.
Yeah. And so do you find that the product data, content is just like because we see this, where like we ask, like, hey, what's your plan for product data? Do you have your product data? They're like, oh, it's just going to come from the ERP. Like they like, there's a lot of these B2B companies, they just assume that what they have in their ERP is going to be sufficient for commerce, and it's just not.
Yeah, and sometimes they'll say, well, I've got a PIM or I've got a PLM, like a master data management. I'm like, okay, that's great, but so we've actually started to call, people traditionally might say PIM and product information, but we're actually now mostly using the term PXM, and meaning the product experience management, meaning all of the information that you need to enrich product information for all of these new channels, for the web, for mobile. How do you optimize it? How do you enrich it? How do you leverage video, data, like all this stuff, and bring it together? Like, and oh, by the way, like, think about the problem. You got your own core website and you need to enrich that. Well, I'm also selling on 4 other marketplaces. Oh crap, now you need to send that out. How do you keep track of that and update all of that? And so we're working with a lot of, and I like to call it PXM, so that there's, to get away from the confusion, that helps facilitate all of that information.
It's an experience, a product experience.
Well, it's interesting that you're using that term, and I like it. I have to say I like it, because we've talked about user experience for forever, and people are still working on that. And product experience is a critical component of that. And it also ties in with what we were saying even about social just briefly earlier. It's like, well, how are you communicating what's your narrative? Like, and where is that information coming from, and how rich is it? And exactly what you're saying is images, it's text, it's video, and it goes in all of these different places. So product experience management is critical for B2B, and I love it. I'm going to start using that term, and I'm going to make sure I credit you when I use it.
Yeah, what's your product experience? If they say it's a paper catalog, that's a bad sign, right? They're like, what's your product experience like? It's like,
oh, here's the picture. It's a catalog. That's my
let me mail you that catalog.
Exactly.
Or send you a PDF. That's my favorite. Like, let me send you some spec sheets, right? It's like, it's kind of ridiculous when you think about it. It's like, why do they have to send me these like PDFs when it should just be like a web page, right? Like, there's no need for. What do you see as? So we talked about the financial additional value, but that's more valuation, and Wall Street can kind of be a little speculative. Do you have any hard numbers or use cases or data that shows like, hey, the companies that really embrace this, like they grew 3x faster than the companies that were resistant? I know like it's 17 trillion. It's not an easy, you can't generalize, but like, have you guys been able to kind of tell those stories to kind of speed up some of this digital transformation to maybe get past some of the sales resistance or whatever the roadblocks are?
Well, I'll give you a little teaser into, we're in the midst of, we did primary B2B research with some researchers here over the last couple of months. And I've just got some of the early data. And we've shown a correlation of those that have invested in B2B commerce to the top group of growth over the past couple of years. And so we've got a couple of data. So I'll have that hopefully in the next month or two. We'll have it all cleaned up and I'll share. But there's
we're definitely going to want to blast that out on the Trellis side, because
I can't wait to see that.
That's a great marketing for the industry that I think everyone's going to want.
It was pretty interesting to show the correlation between those that had invested, that were ahead of the game in driving growth, and the comments that came back, it was directly related.
How did you guys, was there a way that you were able to measure? Was it based on percentage of penetration, or how do you measure like sophistication in that way?
Is it sophistication or growth?
Or that they had made the right investments in digital commerce?
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Like, how do you determine that they're actually doing what they said, or they're not just a laggard?
Yeah. Going through kind of the analysis of what their actual sales versus what investments in the different technologies had been, and we put them into different cohorts. And the top cohort that we looked at from its return and growth, we looked at how that correlated to their investments, and they happened to be the ones that had been investing the largest percentage in B2B commerce versus others.
Okay. And just, I'm trying to be like super specific so people understand.
Yeah.
B2B commerce, like, was that in the platform investment, the people, the e-com managers, all of the above?
It could be all the above.
Yeah. Okay.
All the above.
Was it because they hired me? Was I the one that brought them to the next level?
It could have been you if we randomly picked one of the companies you worked with. It could have.
You never know.
Deloitte Digital, it's even better, right? It has to,
No, we don't know. We don't know. It's again, to get so the studies make sense. They have to be, independently and randomly picked, etc.
So, of course. I feel like we could just keep we'd keep you here forever, but how have you guys seen the market shift in terms of a balance of in-house versus agency? Do you feel like that? Because we've seen some shifts there and it's gone back and forth. Or is there kind of a mindset you guys have around that you think is a best practice? Or
so I think, again, via different industries, they're in very different segments. And so I'll just first kind of talk about, I've been spending a lot in the chemicals and oil and gas in the last couple of years. For the most part, they didn't have a lot of people in-house, if at all. right? And so we were building the first things first, and they might have had one or two people, right, that were in there, and maybe a technical person there. And so there's very little in that space. And so part of our role is also to help get change roles, and maybe a sales director might move over into a digital role, and a digital marketer and a marketer might come into a digital marketing role, and all of those. And so we're seeing a lot of change like that, where other industries, such as, we do work with a lot of software companies. They're way ahead of the game, right? So they might have much bigger, selling online, digitally marketing, all that stuff. So it just depends on, what industry.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to add, another flavor to that too, I think I've seen similar things. I mentioned mining before. They didn't have any of these sorts of roles. I mean, it really was entirely new to them. They needed people to either be retrained, move over, come in, this sort of thing. But a lot of areas like event management, I was talking to people in a lot of these things, and that has there's an end consumer that's a B2B piece, but there's a whole lot that happens B2B, behind the scenes. They had some marketers, they had some people who were digital, they had whatever, they had to restructure it, but some of those people were there. In mining, they weren't there, right? It's just a very, very different kind of flavor for these different areas.
I think you said made a good point of like you're helping them kind of like start to rethink their organization. I notice a lot of friction, and maybe it's just like the way that the agency business started, or people, the perception around it is that it's like an either or, we're all competing for the same jobs. And I feel like there's almost this like unnecessary competition between like the in-house people and the agency to try and like do the work. Whereas to me, it makes a lot of sense, especially in B2B, where like there's so much room for progression, that they should be working together to build the teams up, right? Like the agency has the experience to help them hire the right people. Because that's another thing I see, is that they're trying to build the team, but they have no experience hiring technical roles or digital roles, because there's no one there, or there's like a guy,
Yeah, that kind of sounds like maybe more of the other segments are more retail or consumer product type of companies that might already have agencies doing some B2C, because a lot of the B2Bs are so far behind, they don't have anybody. And so that's why, in many ways it's I went through the early days of B2C, and this in many ways is like the same thing. Is like, I started talking about OmniChannel and B2C, back in 2006 and 7, right? Like, because they had treated e-commerce so separately. And so in many ways, for a lot of these, I'm like going back to that playbook of how do you holistically think about the change in sales, just like your B2C went through it many years ago.
Yeah, I agree. It's more of a B2C friction, but I think sometimes we see it in B2B. I think it's also just that companies in general aren't used to an agency that's an execution service provider helping them hire people. It's just like a different mindset that they're not generally accustomed to, because they're used to like, hey, you do my marketing and that's it. And you just like, what do you mean?
What's interesting is that in my roles where I'm coming in as an individual consultant, as opposed to the ones where I'm working through an agency, I'm asked more often to help hire people. It seems like there's a strange difference there. It's like, okay, Tim, we're working on project X, Y, and Z, and we'd also like you to help figure out, these job descriptions and these roles and whatever. And that happens less, I think, when I'm coming through an agency role. And I've never quite understood that, but it just, jumping on what you said here, Isaiah, it's kind of an interesting difference.
Well, let's wrap up. How would you, I know we're kind of coming out of time. How would you advise someone to start thinking about their team? Like maybe they have one person, or is it often repurposing? Should they go to outside, fractional roles or full-time roles, or how do you even start that?
Number one thing, bring your salespeople along. Make sure your salespeople are part of it. Make sure they understand they're going to get paid on it. Make sure they understand you're going to help them make more money.
Yeah.
I can't overemphasize enough. Bring the salespeople along.
That's the friction point that you mentioned earlier.
I
Yeah.
love that. I love it. And it ties in with other stuff we've said. Other guests have said similar things, and I completely support that too. And Paul, you brought up so many great points for our listeners here. I would say too, that how a lot of companies have their innovation processes and their lunch and learns where they're doing different educational things in the company. That's also critical. It's an opportunity to just say, okay, folks, if you're in marketing, maybe this is stuff you want to learn, and here are other things we're thinking about doing in the business. You don't necessarily have to look outside for a lot of things. If you're a mature business with a lot of great employees, you kind of rework what's happening internally. And I'm seeing that live in a couple places right now, and it's great to see.
Do you think that they should be like trained up? Like, was that where maybe you would start like, hey, let's get our salespeople engaged in, I don't know, Deloitte Digital Commerce, Academy. Like,
well, I'll let Paul answer this in a second, but the way that I've seen this work, which is fascinating, is I look back, also, and I've had a long career. When I first did this, when e-commerce was very new, people would raise their hand and say, I want to learn the new thing. And so we figured out how to do those kind of training internally. And I'll mention a big company because it's so long ago, LL Bean. LL Bean did that. They hired, they basically trained people in-house who were marketers and salespeople and tech people and whatever, who wanted to learn the new thing, instead of just working on catalog and call center forever, right? And so it was a remarkable moment. I feel like that moment is now for B2B, where you can just do this in a lot of companies.
It makes a lot of sense, right? Train these salespeople to embrace this and learn what it is, right? Like, so they can learn company accounts and yeah.
In fact, like what we try and do is like, what we want to do with B2B commerce is we want to take your best salesperson and put it online. So what are the things that's important to your customer? They understand that. They understand the nuances. They understand all of that stuff around it. And that's what we want to capture. So that's why I can't say enough of bottle your best salesperson and put it online.
It almost sounds like the future of the B2B sales role is also head of digital, kind of, right? Like, if you think about it, they're the mind share of the expertise and selling, and that's now going to be online, right? Like, they almost could become one role.
It's a mix.
Yeah. Go ahead, Paul. Sorry.
No, yeah, I was gonna say, like, I'm working with our sales transformation guys, and they're trying to figure out what is the future of the salesperson, and the future is digital. It doesn't mean the salespeople are going away. It just means how do they use these digital all along? So the data, the leads, how can that help score you? Or, hey, oh, by the way, did you know your customer has been looking at this one product for 20 times? Have you followed up with them? Et cetera, et cetera. Like, all of those things along the path, that's what we're trying to do and really help the whole sales process.
I mean, the joke I always make about this, and I've done this to clients, is like, how many of you in this room, if it's like a big boardroom or something, came to work on a horse with clothes that you made at home, right? I mean, it's like they forget that technology is like part of everything that they do, every aspect of their lives. Like, how many of you are like writing with a quill pen on a piece of parchment? I mean, really, this is just kind of a thought that has to shift, in a way that people have to look at things, and then they're there. They'll dive right in and they'll figure this out.
It almost sounds like this is an opportunity for a new title. Like, it reminds me a little bit of the CRO role. The CRO role, like, because like sales and marketing was disjointed, and now they have like people like, well, let's create the CRO role, and it kind of merges them and bridges the gap. It almost feels like that's kind of what's needed in like this chief sales digital officer kind of thing, right? Is that sort of what you're seeing kind of happen.
Maybe that's a new title you just canned and created.
I like it. I like it. I mean,
I think you come up with a better name than that. Chief Sales Digital Officer. It's a little wordy, but we'll work on that together, and we'll
I like that.
All
right.
Well, on that note, we should probably get close to wrapping up our 100th episode. 100th, I can't believe it. Paul, what last words do you have? How can people reach you? All these wonderful things. Like, what else would you like to say to our listeners?
So sure, I share a lot on Twitter. I'm at Do Forno P. You can see it right up here. And also on LinkedIn. Feel free to reach out and LinkedIn with me. And I'm passionate in helping all around this. This is a new industry that's people are just learning the terms, and one of my passions is to share and like build, and happy to have and really appreciate you guys having this forum to talk about it more, because one of the biggest challenges is just semantics and people understanding what we mean about. And so I think continuing to evolve and getting the conversation out there so that people feel comfortable about what B2B commerce really means.
That's awesome. Yeah, we appreciate that. I do have to make the joke that it's X now, right? I don't know. Are you going to call it Twitter or we'll find you on X? Or
oh, that's right. We do not see you on Twitter.
I had to throw that in there as a little comedy to that.
The everything platform.
Are you on Threads yet, Paul?
I am on Threads.
I am on Threads also. So if people want to be on Threads, go for it. You know. All right. Thank you so much. And again, to all our listeners who made it to 100 episodes, we thank you all, and many, many more to come.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Cheers.